Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, the NDCs We Want, Forests in the Focus, organized by WWF. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Emily Gasparini, and I'm the Communications Specialist with the Forest and Climate team here at WWF. And our presenters today are Fernanda de Carvalho and Shaun Martin of WWF, Erin Beasley of Conservation International, and John Verdieck of the Nature Conservancy. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound very familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. And there are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those can sometimes be caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So try closing some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're also always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat or questions function, and I'll try to get you all sorted out. Along those lines, questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time at the end of the presentation. And after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from both WWF and our presenters from other organizations, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session once I put it up, usually within about a day or two. So thank you again for joining us. And with that, we'll get started. Next slide, please. And I believe, Fernanda, you're up first.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone, for making it to the webinar. My name is Fernanda de Carvalho. I am the Global Policy Manager of the Climate and Energy Practice at WWF International. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. So just to frame the conversation here, I think since 2017, we started talking about 2020 as a super year because it's a key moment for a few of the international environmental processes. And of course, in the climate world, we thought about 2020 as a key ambition moment because it's the year that marks the formal start of the Paris Agreement ratchet mechanism. And countries were expected to come up with stronger NDCs, their national contributions, their national plans under the climate regime. And we had mild expectations for that, even without the COVID-19 crisis, because we knew that the big emitters were not ready to move with stronger commitments, but we still had hope that some would. And now the scenario is that we have those events postponed. COP26 was postponed, not happening this year. Now we have a new date announced, and the date is November 2021. The SBs, the subsidiary bodies meetings that happen every year, and this year were quite special because the SBSTA was planning to have two dialogues, one on oceans, on mitigation and adaptation, and one on land and adaptation. Those dialogues were postponed to October, and the dates are still tentative. They should be confirmed in August. The climate weeks, which are moments to shed a light on regional aspects. And of course, the conversation on forests is important for regions such as Africa, Latin America, and we have, of course, the Asia-Pacific ones. We would have a new one in the Middle East and North Africa this year, postponed, also postponed, and CBD COP15, which was another key moment for shedding a light on nature-based solutions, is not going to happen this year, it's postponed for next year. And we at WWF strongly believe that the call for ambition and the call for putting nature in the center of discussions is not connected to moments. So we think that this is still important, although we understand that the priority now is to deal with the COVID crisis, of course, for all countries. Next slide, please. So on NDCs, on nationally determined contributions, where are we? As of mid-2020, we have 10 countries submitted new NDCs, and those countries represent 3 to 5% of the world's emissions. So we are not even close to where we needed to be, and the countries that we needed to see putting forward ambition. The countries that submitted NDCs are the Marshall Islands, Norway, Suriname, Singapore, Moldova, Chile. In the case of Japan, they didn't quite submit a new NDC because they didn't enhance their ambition. They're basically submitting a document that presents the targets that they have since 2015. New Zealand presented a communication on national processes, and they state that they aim to enhance their ambition by 2021 if a newly created committee points them in the direction to do so and align to 1.5. And we had recently Rwanda and Andorra presenting new and enhanced NDCs. We think it's very important that countries still focused on NDC enhancement, although I already mentioned, we know that the COVID crisis might influence that, but even if those commitments are understood to be postponed to 2021, there are things that need to be done. The processes need to start in 2020 to lay the foundation for those commitments to be updated in 2021. So next slide, please. And here I'm taking the Chile NDC as an example. It's important to mention Chile because they were able to submit an enhanced NDC in April 9th, despite the fact that they were dealing with social unrest by the end of the year. I think everybody remembers that, and that's why the COP couldn't happen there. And they are a middle-income country with a relatively low emissions profile compared to others, but they still were able to present an enhanced NDCs. And I'm citing it as an example because nature-based solutions are included in the NDC among implementation criteria, and they're also included in an integration component that takes into account both their role in mitigation and adaptation, and I think this is an interesting development. They bring some forest targets, and the targets are around the management and recovery of 200,000 hectares of native forests, afforestation of 200,000 hectares by 2030, and of those, 100,000 would be permanent cover and 70,000 native forests, reducing emissions from deforestation and land degradation by 25% by 2030 from their emissions average between 2001 and 2013. And they committed to net zero by 2050, but 50% of this commitment is based on forest removals. So 65 million CO2 tons equivalent. And I think, you know, it's important that those targets here that they put in their NDC to be reached by 2030 make sense for a net zero commitment by 2050. Next slide, please. This is the graphic that they presented when they were in a discussion about their long-term strategy by 2050. And the green that you could see here is the heavy reliance on forest removals. So that begs some discussion and some analysis. I'm just pointing this out here as an example of a country that has incorporated forest in their NDCs. Next slide, please. So one question that was posed to me is how NGOs can influence the discussion on NDC enhancement. And again, I'm bringing the example of Chile here. Chile has put out a consultation process about their NDCs that was called the citizen consultation. So they shared a draft of their NDC and they asked for inputs. And WWF Chile puts together 15 proposals on 15 issues that were important to be taken into account in the Chile NDC. And here is the result, basically a draft, a rough analysis of how they were incorporated in the Chile NDC. You see that there are 5 suggestions that were completely incorporated. There are 8 suggestions that were partially incorporated, and only 2 of them, one referring to terrestrial protected areas, were not incorporated in their NDCs. So what is the role of NGOs? The role of NGOs, of course, is to lobby for what is important with a technical background that some of us have, and it's stronger in different aspects. but we can make a difference and we can put proposals on the table that will be taken on by countries. We are also working under an initiative that's called the NDCs We Want. So it connects very much to the name of this webinar. And we are putting out very soon, we are going to publish a checklist of 5 areas and 20 criteria that we would like to see in NDCs all around the world. And we have already started to analyze the NDCs that have been submitted against those criteria. So there will be information there. There will be lessons for countries that are still on the process of enhancing their NDCs by 2020 or 2021. So next slide, please. And this is my last slide, and I leave you with this question. Is 2021 the new 2020, or how can we make 2021 the new 2020 in the sense that this year should be a turning point in all those processes, these international environmental processes that we would like to see evolving? So we think that in the climate world, in the ambition context, the EU might put out an enhanced NDC by September. The EU-China summit is still not postponed. It could happen virtually, but this could be a key moment for those countries to signal ambition. The US political dynamics with their election could present some change from next year onwards on how the country positions itself in international negotiations related to climate. China, of course, will move if the EU and the US moves. So there could be a change in this broader geopolitical picture of ambition. There is an opportunity also in aligning NDCs and recovery and stimulus packages. We know this is a priority, and that's what countries are putting out as we speak. We can work with countries to try to direct investments to the right sectors, and of course the land use change and forest sector is one of those. Nature-based solutions are still a priority for the UK COP presidency, so there is a political opportunity of shining a light on this very important thing that we are here to discuss today. And they could also be a key component of NDC enhancement, and I'm sure my colleagues that will from now on speak to you will tell you all about how to do it. So thank you very much, and over.
Hello everyone, this is Shaun Martin. I'm the Senior Director for Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience at WWF-US, and I'm also currently the acting lead for our climate and energy portfolio in the US. So Fernanda gave a good overview of the high-level policy considerations for the UNFCCC. I'm going to talk about what it means on the ground primarily, and then how we integrate these on-the-ground activities into NDCs. So nature-based solutions is a deceivingly simple concept, and it is being interpreted by many different ways by different actors depending on your values, the organizational mission, the region of the world that you happen to live in. So when WWF began to focus on nature-based solutions, we decided, like many others, to embrace the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions, which are actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. And IUCN lists 6 societal challenges: climate change, food security, water security, disaster risk, human health, and economic and social development, all very large and broad. But its approaches, notably, are all based on field-based conservation interventions. Next slide, please. So if we want to define what is a nature-based solution, if you conform to the IUCN definition, there are 4 critical elements that must be present for something to count as a nature-based solution. And first, you need a defined societal challenge in one of those 6 categories, a specified ecosystem service that specifically addresses that societal challenge, a conservation intervention to ensure the delivery of that ecosystem service, and we also hope to have defined biodiversity co-benefits. Next slide, please. So if you look at the case of forest and climate, the defined societal challenge is climate change, but that's measured and defined by the number of tons you might sequester through forests. So onto the yellow square, a specified ecosystem service. Ecosystem service here that's being deployed is carbon sequestration from forests. And your conservation intervention can be a range of anything. For this example, I've said we're going to establish new protected areas to sequester that carbon to address the societal challenge. And then through those kinds of actions of establishing a new protection area, we may get co-benefits for biodiversity. For this fictitious Wibbler's monkey, we might be able to stabilize that population of an endangered species. So if you have all these four components, we think that's a good, solid nature-based solution. Next slide, please. And then if you're laying out a theory of change for nature-based solutions, the field-based intervention leads to both improved sustained ecosystem services and biodiversity co-benefits, and ultimately that reduces the societal challenge. So you design a nature-based solution by starting with the societal challenge and working backwards to the field-based conservation intervention. For the theory of change, it begins with the intervention and ends in the reduced societal challenge. Next slide, please. And then when we were looking at our own work, in addition to all those field-based conservation interventions, there's a lot of other work that's around the nature-based solutions, but isn't a nature-based solution itself. And these are all the conditions that we need to enable nature-based solutions, things like policy advocacy, research, planning and design, capacity building, finance, monitoring, evaluation. Next slide. And so for WWF, when we look at nature-based solutions for climate, we really think about this in two ways. So often when people talk about nature-based solutions, what they mean is nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation, and that's addressing the challenge of climate change. Next slide, please. But if we're looking at nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation, what we're doing is addressing climate impacts on all those other societal challenges. Climate change exacerbates those. And so if you want to address any of them, you really need to incorporate climate risk management as you're addressing those other societal challenges with nature. Next slide, please. So for WWF, we're grouping both of these together and calling them nature-based solutions for climate. So our nature-based solutions for climate include both mitigation through nature and adaptation through nature. Next slide, please. So we've developed our own working definition for nature-based solutions for climate, and it's broken into those four components that I talked about earlier to conform to the IUCN definition. So the intentional use of ecosystems and ecosystem services, that is the solution. Many people define the solution as the conservation intervention, but the solution is actually the use of ecosystems and ecosystem services to measure climate change adaptation and mitigation outcomes. So those are the defined societal challenges, supported by actions that avoid degradation of protect, restore, and manage the functionality of those ecosystems in a changing climate. That's the conservation intervention. And the important thing here is that you're actually considering climate risks on ecosystems as you develop those interventions. And then the last part of the definition is while delivering non-climate related co-benefits for people and nature. Next slide. So in a theory of change sort of diagram, this is how it works. On the right, you have the measurable climate-related outcomes. They're either tons of CO2 or number of people with reduced vulnerability to climate hazards. We chose those because those are the two measurable outcomes that the Green Climate Fund must see to support any work with its funding. And then through ecosystems and ecosystem services like forests for carbon sequestration or mangroves for storm surge attenuation, that is the solution. And then we use conservation interventions to support those solutions. by maintaining functionality, by avoiding degradation, protect, restore, and manage in the context of a changing climate. And those ecosystems also deliver important co-benefits, not related to climate necessarily, for people and nature. Next slide. So this is often what we're finding is people are not designing necessarily for climate change. They're designing their conservation interventions primarily to address biodiversity challenges. And when you do that, the climate benefits tend to be co-climate benefits, co-benefits, and they're not necessarily quantified, measured, monitored, or evaluated, and therefore it's difficult to get funding for those so-called nature-based solutions. And finally, our definition looks at maintaining functionality of ecosystems, but conservation interventions usually focus on maintaining integrity, and those might not give you lasting benefits in a changing climate. Next slide. So what we did is we took all those that good thinking behind that work, and we looked at 159 NDCs and how they were talking about nature-based solutions in their NDCs, and we found a lot of gaps. And so to help enhance NDCs that are now being revised in terms of nature-based solutions, as a contribution to the NDC partnership, WWF developed 8 simple recommendations for countries to consider. They're here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just a few. Number 1, include both adaptation and mitigation as in your nature-based solutions. 2, set ambitious, measurable, and time-bound targets. Many of the NDCs talk and very generally, but without specifying numbers, and then it's hard to count a commitment towards a goal if you're not measuring them. We also advocate for the use of natural ecosystems over artificial or modified ecosystems, which is included in the IUCN definition, but we believe that to maximize biodiversity benefits, you really want to prefer the use of natural ecosystems. And we encourage use of all kinds of ecosystem types. And number 5 is, as an adaptation person, is one that I really stress. You really need to acknowledge and manage the climate risks that threaten the long-term viability of nature-based solutions. And that brings me to my last slide. Next. So we're often thinking that, and it's proven in the past, that if when nature is pristine and preserved, that they do deliver ecosystem services, including those for disaster risk reduction and carbon sequestration. But like doctors and nurses and healthcare workers who are at the front lines of COVID, those healthcare workers are at risk to COVID just like the general population, and perhaps even more so. And so we take extra measures to protect those healthcare workers from COVID. We're not doing the same thing for ecosystems necessarily. That article on the right, many of you know of the fires in Australia last year where rainforests were burning down. That's not supposed to happen. If we're counting on those forests to deliver carbon sequestration or some kind of adaptation benefit and they're burning down, they're not going to last very long. Actually, all that stored carbon goes into the atmosphere. So we really need to pay attention to the climate risks on nature and start to manage them as part of our conservation interventions. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brittany Williams, and I am Senior Program Officer for the Forest and Climate Team at WWF US. Before I hand it off to Erin Beasley, I just wanted to provide some brief context for the work that WWF, CI, TNC, and others do together in this space. There is a coalition of forest and climate experts from several NGOs who regularly collaborate on key advocacy initiatives in order to amplify our collective reach and impact on forest-related policy. And one such example of this type of collaboration was the publication in 2019 of the report that you see here that Erin will discuss in more detail. And with that, I hand it over to you, Erin.
Thank you, Brittany. My name is Erin Beasley. I'm the Senior Manager for Climate Policy at Conservation International. And I'll speak briefly about this guide that we prepared called the Guide to Including Nature in Nationally Determined Contributions, to specifically focus on the forest part of how we can look at forest ecosystems in terms of their climate mitigation and adaptation outcomes. So as part of this document, it's quite short, it's about 20 pages. It's intended primarily for a policy audience or policymakers as a bridging document to have a technical and political discussion about the issues that should be taken into consideration when countries are thinking about recognizing work that they have perhaps done in other parts, in other sectors of their government, in order to reflect that as part of national climate action. These are recommendations that we have for best practice, and they build off of the existing guidance that has been provided by the UNFCCC. But I want to just preface the points that I'm going to make here as they are recommendations that this group of NGOs has put together based on the guidance that countries have agreed to. So why do we want to speak about forests in terms of climate action? Certainly, there are really important adaptation benefits that come from forest conservation, protection, and management and restoration related to ecosystem services for water, livelihood benefits, other economic benefits that may come from forest management. And also, I want to focus on this graph that we have here as also recognizing the scale of mitigation potential that comes from a suite of activities connected to the land sector. So in the top section of this graph, next to the circle that says forests, we see a few bars related to specific mitigation pathways from activities from restoration, avoided forest conversion, which is avoided deforestation, natural forest management, improved forest plantations, avoided wood fuel, and fire management. So these mitigation benefits come as the result of avoided loss of carbon stocks from living ecosystems, as well as the enhancement of the carbon that may be in those ecosystems. And we see that when we look at forests, there are very significant mitigation potentials from this sector in relation to global climate action. So these are looking at the gigatons of CO2 per year that can be avoided by 2050. It gives you a little bit of comparison between the outcomes of different pathways. We also see that there are activities with mitigation potential from actions in agricultural lands as well as grasslands and wetlands. Go to the next slide, please. So what do countries think about these activities? It's nationally determined contributions are prepared by governments. So it's very important to understand what they are thinking about in terms of the inclusion of nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions as part of their national climate action in their nationally determined contribution. So when we look at this graph published by the NDC partnership, we see that when it comes to nature-based solutions, country governments have been requesting support primarily in this yellow section, which is defining or updating targets around nature-based solutions for their NDC. They've also asked for support in other topics, such as how to improve the data that's available and the monitoring, reporting, and verification systems for nature-based solutions, as well as stakeholder consultations and a host of other areas of support. So we as a group of NGOs, we developed a set of recommendations to help guide national decision makers in the consideration of forests and other nature-based solutions as part of an NDC. These recommendations are some of them are general to all of the mitigation and adaptation actions that could occur in the land sector for agriculture, grasslands, coastal wetlands, or forests, and some of them are specific to forests. So I'll go through a few of those now. Go to the next slide, please. So the way that we include forests in NDCs, an NDC is a policy document. It can vary from 5 to often 20 pages or more. It's where the government sets out the specific actions for mitigation, and if desired, the government can also recognize activities that will be related to adaptation. So in practical terms, the way that forests can be included in nationally determined contributions is that they're written into this document. I want to connect that, however, to the implementation of the NDC. We're looking for more than just the mention of specific ecosystems in nationally determined contributions. We want to see that the inclusion of particular activities reflects actions or efforts that the government plans to implement. And this is a very important part of actually achieving the mitigation and adaptation outcome from these ecosystems. So the first step for doing this is that we encourage countries to use the guidance on nationally determined contributions that comes from the Paris Rulebook, which was agreed by countries under the UN climate negotiations, or the UNFCCC, as well as guidance that's provided in the IPCC guidelines, preferably depending on the capacities and data availability of the country. We recommend using the most up-to-date IPCC guidelines, which would be the 2006 guidelines, which help countries to understand how the accounting of these activities should be reflected both in their national greenhouse gas inventory as well as then reflected in their nationally determined contribution. We also encourage countries to consider preparing sector-specific targets for nature and to make sure that those targets, as Shaun mentioned, are time-bound and quantitative as possible. In the guide for including nature in nationally determined contributions, we describe kind of what these targets can look like, and they can range from anywhere from a non-quantitative policy commitment to more quantitative, more quantitative targets for emissions reductions or let's say area conserved or scale of action. We also encourage countries to build on the existing efforts and commitments. So for example, many countries have already developed national biodiversity strategies and action plans. Many countries already have national REDD strategies. These are the types of existing efforts that should be incorporated or reflected into the NDC preparation process or NDC revision process to understand what actions are already ongoing related to mitigation or adaptation in the country from forest. So we also want countries to improve their information over time. So in some cases, the data availability around, let's say, forest cover or forest carbon may be limited or incomplete for a particular country. So there are some steps that countries can do to recognize this lack of data availability, but still also recognize activities that the country has prioritized for forest conservation, restoration, or improved management. And then finally here, very important for countries to describe the types of institutional arrangements that they're building, either between different ministries or data sharing arrangements that are necessary in order for this to be successfully implemented within the government. And let's go to the next slide. And then very specifically for forests, there has been some guidance from the UNFCCC that encourages countries, when appropriate, to recognize that changes, let's say in stocks of harvested wood products, and the impacts of natural disturbances on forests in relation to goals or targets within the NDC. Again, mentioning any type of measures that are planned or in progress to facilitate change, and also discussing the monitoring systems that are in place, as well as the social and environmental safeguards that come from these activities. So these are a few things that the countries should be taking into account. I'll give you one quick example for Costa Rica and then pass over to my colleague. Next slide, please. So in Costa Rica, we see that the country in their NDC has included an economy-wide target to reduce emissions by 25%. So they have not specified a sector-specific target in their mitigation section. However, under their adaptation section, they recognize the government plans to increase forest coverage to 60%. And then they also describe the government mechanisms, the public mechanisms in this case, that the country will prioritize in order to improve governance of forestry resources. And the first is the National Forestry Finance Fund Environmental Services Payment Program and the Forest Certification Program. And this recognizes the value of water ecosystem services that are provided by the country's forests to the particular land users. And this is a public mechanism, as well as the important linkages with the country's National Biological Corridor System and National Protected Area System. So the governance around these two activities have been highlighted as priority areas of action or programs to achieve these forest-related goals. So to summarize my key message here, I just want to recognize that countries in all contexts can look to forests and other ecosystems as part of their climate action. And there are tools and support to help guide them through that process. And I will pass off to my colleague, John.
Thank you so much. This is John Verdieck from the Nature Conservancy. At TNC, I'm the Director of International Climate Policy. I would like to just share with you a couple of specific examples of countries we're working in to include, we're calling it natural climate solutions. We use the term NCS to define mitigation only. We also use nature-based solutions to include more of an adaptation and the mitigation both together. So if there's any questions on the definitions, that's kind of it, but we're talking about the land sector broadly. One of the things we'd like to talk about, and we're working in Colombia, is working with the government, as Erin mentioned, and others as well. So how do we make sure that we're working with the government to help them implement the reforms and strategies that they want to do, making sure that we're not suggesting something that's not possible or that is not desirable or doesn't fit within perhaps their economic context. So in the context of Colombia, one of the things that we've done is started out by working with the government of Colombia and finding out what data is available and taking basically a science-based approach, similar to what we saw Erin mention before, of there is different pathways, whether it's reducing deforestation or whether it's working through nutrient management or something like that matters for each country and that is most important. So what we've looked at is where is the largest mitigation potential in a country? Where do we have data available that can support us to do work if we want to? Where do we look where, are there internal capacities either in the government or local academia to conduct the future analyses that are needed? What other co-benefits are available, whether it's biodiversity, et cetera, water, and that sort of thing, that we make sure that we're getting, the largest kind of return on the work that we're doing. And what is the cost effectiveness? We know that, if a reduction of a ton of greenhouse gases is going to cost $100 per ton, it's probably going to be a little less possible to get some traction with the government than if the same, or a different reduction is going to be $10 per ton. So we take all of these different pieces into consideration and start to build up a plan. Within Colombia, we've narrowed down to 3 specific pathways that we focus on the most. They're listed here as avoided deforestation, forest restoration, also working on trees and agricultural lands. And these were all kind of built out from those kind of constraints that I just mentioned before. Could you go to the next slide? If you look at the bars, the green bars, the horizontal bars that are going in the bottom left corner of this map, this is work that we've taken from that original Griscom et al. Study that you saw earlier presented of the global pathways. And we try to downscale it into the national kind of scenario so that we can see, obviously Colombia is going to have a different context and different types of interventions that are going to make sense than Honduras or than Gabon or wherever else we're looking in the world. So we need to make sure that we're having nationally appropriate measures here. As we looked into Colombia, it's pretty obvious which are the 2 largest mitigation potential bars, reforestation and avoided forest conversion. So these were, some countries it's not as obvious, some countries it's quite obvious where our time and our funding should focus. Could you go to the next slide, please? One of the things that we start to do then is we try to start putting in, and these are all preliminary results that aren't out there yet. It starts coming up from our Colombia team of, we're looking at these different pathways. We try to look at we use mapping, we use all sorts of different, different countries have different data available, and we try to use it all where possible and try to build up decision-making tools. So if you're the Minister of the Environment, or you're the Prime Minister, or you're the President of the country, and you need to decide what your next NDC is going to be, it's always good to have scientific evidence that backs up the numbers that you're about to put out publicly. So these are 3 maps that look at these, the avoided forest conversion, the forest restoration, and the trees and agricultural lands, different pathways. As we start to build these out, we can start to find the mitigation potential. We start to see the mapping of also the kind of physical and spatial placement of where they are. If you go to the next slide as well too, then we start to put them together. These decision tools, as we start to look at all the different scenarios where government can take action, as I mentioned before, giving more data available to the policymakers or to the decision makers so that they can make the best decisions possible is one of the places we've found out that's been really helpful. And so this is just an example of where we're going with Colombia. It's bringing a bunch of science to the table. It's also coming in with some economic decision-making tools and looking at cost curves coming from marginal abatement costs and that sort of thing, and looking at, where are your $100 per ton reductions? Where are your $10 per ton reductions? To give that information to the government so that they can make the appropriate decisions for themselves. So that's the case of Colombia. If I can go on one more slide, please. Also, we're working on the United States as well too, and obviously the United States is a tricky one right now with the NDC and the Trump administration's decision on the Paris Agreement. But I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we've been doing there as well too, being that we are working with the states in the United States to do a lot of the similar work, building up data into creating climate plans and climate commitments that come out of the state level rather than federal level. Similarly to Colombia, if you look in the bottom left corner, you'll see these green bars coming across. That's for the whole country together. So each of the different states has a different mitigation potential that we've tried to break it down based on data. So this is the country as a whole. We try to think through, what can we get? We're gonna have to cobble the different states together to get a lot of the inventory data and everything to come together. Next slide, please. The next thing we did is we took all these states together, and all of these slides are available if you look at natureforclimate.org. These mappers are there for the global mapper that I showed you, Colombia and the United States before. There's also a United States mapper that starts to break this down into the different states of the US. One of the interesting things that we have here is we had some very good spatial resolution data available for the United States, and so we were able to break this down to basically county level data, which is one scale below the states. And with that, we found out the size of each state's mitigation potential. If you look kind of in the bottom center here, you see the different states' potentials. And then if you would go forward one more slide, I've zoomed in to the state of California on the West Coast, so on the Pacific Ocean, and we've looked at their specific mitigation potential. Within that, we have these toggle bars on the left side that look at the different pathways. And that is where we built in the economic constraints of, we know that some of these different interventions are more costly than others. Providing this kind of information to a state governor or a country prime minister to start making decisions on, if they know they have a certain amount of money that they can invest or that they're receiving from somewhere from the Green Climate Fund or something, and they want to get the largest mitigation potential, or they want to bring in the largest biodiversity kind of constraints, this is the kind of information that we can provide as we start building these out for countries. So with that, I just want to note, the last thing I would say here is we are currently working with countries, as Fernanda mentioned before, there's a lot of NDCs we're expecting to come forward this year to build up the next cycle of the Paris Agreement. And obviously as we are doing this, we're trying to enhance the amount of nature within these different NDCs. For some countries, that is increasing the overall number they put forward on their target to have a more ambitious target. For other countries, that's actually widening the number of sectors that they've put in. If they said forests before, but they did not also say agriculture, how can we broaden the scope to get all greenhouse gas emissions in? Different countries have different kind of layers that we're working on. So as we try to do that, it's I think we know that we have solutions, we know that we have data available, and now we're trying to share this data so that we can have the boldest implementation that we possibly can have in this NDC cycle and in the future NDC cycles coming forward as well. So thank you, and I appreciate it.
Thank you all. That was fantastic. And as you can see from the questions rolling in, we have quite a few. I'm going to ask you all something that's come up in a few of the questions, which is the issue of plantations and the definition of forest. So Erin, if you could let us know what definition of forest you guys used while you were preparing this document, and whether monoculture trees, tree plantations would qualify. And then if any of you can speak to NDC targets, forest NDC targets that explicitly include or exclude plantations, and any potential trends or issues that countries should be aware of in that process, that would be fantastic. So Erin, let's start off with you.
Sure. So definition of forest is actually up to the national government. So that's also a topic that's nationally determined, as well as the NDC is also determined nationally. So it would be up to the government to determine what specific activities or technologies they want to use to achieve their climate action in any sector. So there is a significant amount of national sovereignty and self-determination that goes with the selection of activities at the national level. And certainly also it is a national process, and one of the recommendations that's part of our guide is highlighting the importance of consultation at the national level and the subnational level of all relevant stakeholders for those the selection of those activities. So certainly the Paris Agreement is very important because it brings all the countries in the world together for climate action and sets some basic frameworks about what that action looks like. But when it gets to some of the more specific selection of activities, those are left to national governments to determine as part of their NDCs. So that would also apply to forest plantation or the selection of what type of restoration strategy or reforestation strategy that the country wants to use.
Thank you, Erin. Does anybody else want to speak to the question of other reforestation targets, including plantations? Shaun, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, everything Erin has said is true. It's really up to the national governments to determine this. However, in our work, we are, to the extent that we can advise governments in making those decisions, we are advocating the use of natural forests rather than forest plantations for a number of reasons. One, they're not very good for biodiversity. And there's a lot of evidence that, forest plantations, depending on the species, can actually destroy water tables, which exacerbates local problems. And particularly though this isn't a issue so much for governments, it's a lot of private sector companies are promoting afforestation and forest plantations to produce returns on their investments. And there is some value in that, but it's not the best way to sequester carbon. And also, if you plant a forest plantation with the objective of harvesting it, you actually lose the carbon that you stored when you harvest it. But you do that with the expectation that the forest will be replanted and grow back. However, after 20 or 30 years, when the wood is ready to harvest, we're not guaranteed that the climate will be in a state that will actually support more trees in the same area. So it's a risky proposition, I would say, to invest in forest plantations for harvesting purposes anyway. Thanks.
Thank you, Shaun. As you both mentioned, a lot of, this entire process is country-owned, NDC process, and so a lot of it is dependent on the priorities and the resources that the countries have available. One of our participants was asking if you can highlight some of the key hindrances to countries submitting NDCs and whether there are any efforts to sort of manage these challenges. Fernanda, I don't know if you can speak to that first.
Well, I think that, of course, there's a new challenge out there. There is the COVID crisis that is consuming, mind space from ministers that should be planning. And we are also very strongly with CAN and other organizations advocating for broad participation processes, because it's not about what goes in the NDCs, but how those NDCs are built. And of course, those participation processes will be impaired by this situation. But basically, that requires engaging many governmental sectors that also affects government budgets. So it's not an easy exercise. It's an exercise that demands mostly political will. And yeah, those would be some of the obstacles that countries face for enhancing their NDCs. And to the previous question, I would just add that, I was going to say something, but we just jumped to the question. WWF Chile has been quite critical of involving plantations and the Chile focus on plantations. There has been discussions in the countries we have been involved in. So just to add that, over.
Thanks, Fernanda. Sorry if I jumped to the next question too quickly. In that mind, does anybody else want to weigh in on this last question before I move to the next one? Okay, seems like no. So one of our participants is asking about other ways for other civil society organizations to get involved in these processes in terms of having NDCs incorporate NBS or NCS in their targets, and are wondering if we have recommendations as organizations who often work together, as well as individually in these processes. Are there platforms available for other organizations to get involved? Is there, do we have recommendations for advocating for some of these inclusion of these targets to national governments? John, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, thanks. I think two platforms come to mind right off the top of my head. One is the Nature for Climate platform, which I think many of the folks here are part of NGOs that are part of that coalition, which is trying to get the word out and make sure that everybody does know that nature does have this giant potential to change and to hopefully meet the targets of Paris Agreement. The other one is, there was a slide on there earlier from the NDC partnership. It's a partnership where WRI directs support for a lot of country requests for their working on their NDCs. And it gives opportunities for the different NGOs or international organizations like the World Bank who have capacity to support the countries to come together to do this. So there's numerous, those are just a couple kind of global ones. There's also a lot of regional and local ones as well too.
I can add to that, Emmeline. As part of the NDC partnership, as I said in my presentation, WWF developed simple guidelines for countries, and we hope that civil society organizations will use those guidelines and recommendations in their advocacy. I sent it along as a resource for everyone to use. What's useful about that report is we actually took language from previously submitted NDCs to actually demonstrate what those recommendations look like in an NDC context. And so it's very easy for a country to look at a recommendation and see what other countries have done to meet that recommendation and then sort of adapt and replicate it in their own NDCs.
Yeah, and I would add that at a more high level, there is some work done for recommendations for NDCs in general that, of course, one of our recommendations that we are going to put out is measurable nature-based solutions. And then we get to the level that Shaun is mentioning. But again, in the high level, the Climate Action Network, which encompasses, more than 1,000 environmental NGOs from all over the world. They also just launched the paper yesterday that's on their website. I'll try to find the link to share here on transformative NDCs, and there is a session on forest and nature-based solutions there that could be a resource for people too. Over.
Thank you. It looks like we just have 1 minute left, so I think we're going to have to save these additional questions for possible follow-up after the webinar. But thank you all again for participating. And if we can go to the next slide, please, because we have come to the end of our time today. So I really want to thank all of our presenters for sharing your expertise with our community, and to thank the participants for sending us in your very thoughtful and engaging and very detailed questions. This is fantastic. And you'll all receive a follow-up email in about an hour with additional resources that are specific to this webinar, several of which were just recently mentioned in our answering of the questions. Next, please. If you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, the recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel, usually within about 24 hours. And you can also find recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.